Today's reading is from Rays of the One Light, Weekly Commentaries on the Bible and Bhagavad Gita by Swami Kriyananda. Our reading this week is entitled The Inner Kingdom. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. Most people imagine that the inner kingdom, as Jesus describes it, lacks the fascination they attribute to sense life, the bright lights, the diverse attractions, the joys and the laughter. Little do they realize what a vast universe exists in their own selves. There are passages in the Old and New Testaments of the Bible that describe aspects of this inner kingdom. In the book of Genesis, we read, "And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil." This garden was in no earthly place. It exists even now in the very self of every human being. The legend of Adam and Eve is allegorical. It describes how the first human beings dissipated their spiritual energy centered in the spine. The spine is the channel through which flows the river of baptism and of spiritual life. The Bhagavad Gita tells us, "The wise speak of an eternal Ashvata tree with its roots above and its branches below. The tree of life, spoken of also in Genesis, is the spine. Its roots are above in the brain's energy. Its branches are the outward spreading nervous system. When the sap, which is to say the energy, flows downward, the consciousness is drawn into delusion. On the other hand, when the energy is drawn upward in deep meditation, the consciousness is drawn towards its eternal source, God, and is at last united with him." Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita therefore urges his chief disciple Arjuna to embrace the yoga science, the path of meditation. "The yogi," he says, "is greater than the ascetic, greater even than the followers of the paths of wisdom, jnana yoga, or of action, karma yoga. Be thou, O Arjuna, a yogi." For those who would find the divine truth, Krishna gives this description of the yogi. "Steadfast a lamp burns, sheltered from the wind. Steadfastly meditating, solitary. Such is the likeness of the yogi's mind, shut from sense storms and bright to heaven." Wherever you are, whatever your outward beliefs and observances, seek God in the silence of your soul. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om.
Good morning to everyone. I see many of you were here yesterday, last evening for our auction, but I suppose somebody will tell us more about that later. Anyway, it was a lot of fun, and proceeds raised will help towards the future fellowship hall there just outside. Well, following a theme that Padma raised last week, drawing from her rich cultural Jewish heritage, many people have wondered why it was that the Buddhists didn't have any more luck converting the Jews of ancient Palestine than the Christians did a few centuries later. And understand that when the Buddhist missionaries got there, they were, of course, interrogated by the Pharisees, naturally. And so they came to a conclusion. They said, the Torah says one should love one's neighbor as thyself. And you say, this Buddha, he says there is no self. So, are we off the hook?
That was not a Jewish accent. That was an Irish
Evidently not.
accent. So, okay.
So, all right already. So we're not off the hook. Well, you have to have a little bit of fun. In some recent classes I was part of, I was reminded and drew upon an interchange between Christ, Jesus, and his disciples. And it's one I enjoy quoting from time to time. In this, he had just told to the assembled crowd on the hillside the wonderful parable of the sower and the seed, and how seed landing on the rocks would maybe sprout and then die and so forth. But then afterwards, clearly the crowd had dispersed. The disciples come, and they're a little ticked, frankly. They're a little frustrated. You can feel it in their tone. They say, why do you always speak in parables? And and then Jesus goes on to speak rather plainly, even harshly to some people, and saying to them, I speak in parables, because hearing they hear not, seeing they see not. To you I speak the truth. Then he went on to say that to them that hath, more is given, and to those who hath little, that which they have is taken away. And I often like to wryly remark that it sounds like the Republican platform. No offense. And so we learn from this revealing interchange, and there aren't that many of them, but there are a number of them in the Bible, that there is an esoteric teaching given by great masters in East and West for those with, as Jesus said numerous times, ears to hear and eyes to see. We're privileged in this time of relatively awakening consciousness, to be privy to have access to what was not very long ago the secret teachings, the esoteric teachings of the inner kingdom, which is today's subject. Well, it's a pretty darn good subject. So far I've gotten 2 blog articles out of it. One, I've only published one of them, but you know, there's a great controversy going on in society from New Delhi to Delhi, California, which is yoga spiritual, or is it simply exercise? I went with a group of yoga teachers some years ago to Olympia to testify at some hearings there about whether or not one of the agencies, I can't remember which one, needed to regulate yoga teachers. Well, the good news, or at least from our point of view, is that we so clearly represent the ancient and the tradition of yoga, which is inextricably linked with spiritual growth and so forth, that we were exempted from that. And the line they drew was somewhere in the sand between fitness centers and gyms, where clearly the emphasis was on exercise, and they felt the prerogative to regulate that. I don't know what they did, but that's what they concluded, and it was good enough for me. But nonetheless, we have this teaching which is based on practice, not really based on belief. If you manipulate the body, move the body, if you use the breath, control the breath, calm the mind, and so forth, there's no necessity of a particular belief system. And so when Yogananda came, and he certainly isn't the only one, but he was among the leading lights of the 20th century for sure, who came, he published the thesis of his life's work in his, though ghost-written, book, The Science of Religion. Now, in his case, He never divorced the one from the other. He never divorced the innate spirituality of the practice of yoga from its scientific aspect. Scientific meaning, as he would put it, give me 12 young men of the worst types, and I'll teach them Kriya Yoga, and if they practice as I instruct them for how long? A long time, a couple of years maybe, I'll make them saints. And although it was a bit of a preposterous claim, he made quite a few preposterous claims in his life. He was quite a showman and so forth, but he had that spiritual power to change people's lives. One time in Carnegie Hall in 1925, he chanted, "Oh God, Beautiful," for an hour and a half, and many people were transformed by that. Can you imagine 1925 chanting, "Oh God, Beautiful" in Carnegie Hall, standing room only? His friends warned him not to do it. They figured out would come what P.G. Wodehouse called the tomato motif. You know, the vegetable motif, which back in those days I guess was still the fashion if you didn't like an entertainer. But nonetheless, we look at what's happening in the world today and the practice of yoga. It is a controversy because, as one person remarked in response to what I had written, well, it depends on the intention of the teacher, doesn't it? And most certainly it does, and the intention of the student. But we have this fact, and we see it all the time here at Ananda. People say, yeah, I started taking yoga at the gym and so forth, and after a while I kind of realized there was more to it than that. And because it awakens inside of us something that is already there, that doesn't believe, that doesn't depend on beliefs. And so there is a power, and this is the power that resonates with our society, with our culture. If you'll bear with me a bit, our racial memory goes back not that very far. I mean, maybe many of us could say something about our grandparents. Maybe many of us knew our grandparents. Fine. Probably very few are great-grandparents, and even if you happened to met them once or knew their name or where they lived or something, you probably have 4 or 5 statistics, and that's it. In any case, if you think of the human racial memory, for all practical purposes, all we really know is hardship, serfdom. Until the modern era, industrial age, etc., people lived a very hard life, a very short life, a very insecure life. Disease, famine, wars. If you were born to the soil, as most people in fact were, or even a tradesman, and that's what your father did, that's what you did. I'm not going to even talk about the fate of women. That's still being exorcised even today. Nonetheless, if you think of it that way in terms of racial memory, the burden of such a hard, hard life, romanticized as it is in history and movies with the, great leading lights or some of the great geniuses of the various centuries, an artist or a scientist or a saint and so forth, fine, but that wasn't the common lot. And so if you see it that way, if you are willing to consider that that's our racial memory, and you come born into these bodies, into this nation, into this culture, I mean, by comparison, we're in a candy store. And so what we're seeing happening in the world today is nations develop, and as education and so forth is made available, and technology makes knowledge available, we see people racing for the exits, as it were, just straining their 5 senses to overindulge, to have it all, to be rich, young, beautiful, famous, whatever, forever. And so the kind of hangover, you might say, that happens when we outstrip the resources of our planet, outstrip the resources of our 5 senses, the diseases that we have, and the suffering, especially mental and emotional suffering that results from trying to have it all and have it perfectly outside ourselves, is a hangover that is of astounding proportions. And it's not diminishing. Don't be a fool. It's growing. You know, gone are the hippie days of the age of Aquarius when everything was going to get better. And it will get better, but not tomorrow, not today. Right now we see great struggles going on the earth. And people like you and I, and assembled in a sacred space like this, we know in our hearts that the answer isn't out there. It isn't in the five senses. It isn't in ego gratification. And so as if in a divine response to a racial call, to a call from hearts born and unborn, pre-existing and eternal, but evolving yet at the same time, a call for a solution, for a healing, for a cure to the hangover of over-satiety, overindulgence, that has come with the power of awakening that this ascending age has granted us, the power to self-destruct, which is the battle today, to destroy those who are different than you, who don't believe as you do. Just because they're different, they're worthy of destruction. Nobody in this room thinks that way, and in many ways, people like you and I live in a bubble of, well, relative health and prosperity perhaps, but certainly goodwill and friendship and so on. But are we blind? Do you not read the headlines? Do you not look around you, eyes to see and ears to hear? How can you be happy in the midst of such? You see, yoga, and I want to digress a little bit more to say that, what do I mean by yoga? Most people, even in India, mean by the word yoga the physical movements, positions, and so forth, known as hatha yoga. It is so because out of the time from which we've come, we've misidentified what yoga really is with the physical body. So sort of physically bound and ego bound was the racial consciousness of humanity out of the time from which we've come. But yoga means union. It means yoke. It means to unite. It means to bring together. It means to achieve a perfection, a oneness, a happiness, a truth. And yoga then is the science by which, using the breath and using the body also, because the body breathes, the body has energy flowing through it, by which we can experience that truth. I want to say there was a student in my most recent class, a fellow who's new to yoga, and so when I say yoga, I want to finish the thought. I mean the awareness, the awakening, the energizing, the control of that link between our consciousness and soul and our humanity as a body and ego and personality, which is the vitalizing life force that is so much the subject of alternative healing and so forth, so much the subject of success in worldly matters and so forth, to get your energy right. And, energy is the most common buzzword in all walks of life. And so this student I was talking to has had a whole lifetime in the martial arts. He listed off martial arts I'd never even heard of. But then he made what I thought was a very wise statement, something that I've often thought, but because I don't have the experience, first-hand knowledge of the martial arts, I couldn't actually aver. He said, you know, I've done all these things, he said, but in the martial arts, you take that chi, that prana, that life force, and you are taught to direct it outward for whatever various reasons. All can be perfectly good and wonderful. But he says, in yoga, I have learned to center myself in that chi and that prana and take it within and lift it into the higher consciousness of my soul. And thus it is, when Paramahansa Yogananda long ago, whose teachings are practiced here, said that in the future, in centuries ahead of us, self-realization will be seen as the true purpose of spirituality. He was speaking of yoga. He wasn't speaking of a new Catholic church or something by which everyone would join and belong. He was referring to the racial insight that what is really important is our energy, is our consciousness, and uniting that consciousness to the great consciousness in which we live and breathe, of which we are one, is the only meaningful goal of life. Now that's going to take quite a few centuries at the rate we're going to appear, but it will appear because we are in an ascendant age. But people like you and I don't have to wait. We don't have to die and go to heaven or die and be reborn and ride the Ferris wheel to the top of human consciousness. That's a bit risky, riding Ferris wheels anyway. And so this thing we call yoga is, yes, it's popular in the gyms and so forth, but so much more is happening because it is offering, the divine is answering a call of souls on this planet, at least at this point in its evolution, to give us something that is free from the narrow sectarian and all that kind of belief stuff, that can give us the knowledge that we need in order to survive. This Ashwatha tree, this tree of life, mentioned throughout the Bible, it's not as if these things are new, but as Jesus with his parables knew, he couldn't openly teach some of these things. And so now, however, we're ready. When Babaji met, when Lahiri Mahashai and Raniket, where some of us went last year, in India, was given the key to Kriya Yoga, he said, which will encircle the globe, which has encircled the globe. And he said he freed it from the strictures of the medieval times where people had to leave everything and undergo rigorous physical and mental training at the feet of their spiritual teacher, and to take a vow of complete renunciation and so forth, that those strictures have been lifted for our time, so that people in all walks of life, of all races and so forth, could have access to this. This is an incredible revolution. And for Ananda here to be representing the heart of yoga, not divorced so that it's sort of diluted and, oh, it'll help your thighs or your sinuses or something like that. All of that sort of thing. I've had yoga teachers tell me that they're not permitted, for example, to use Sanskrit in their yoga studios. Like Queen Victoria, we are not amused. So is it a religion? I mean, is it spiritual? Is it a religion? Call it what you want. Or is it exercise? The dirty little secret in the yoga movement is that it's nothing but spiritual. I mean, it's truly everything but spiritual, everything. Well, you know what I'm trying to say. Spirituality. Of course it is. Just as individuals practicing these things without any particular guidance or understanding can awaken to a state of calmness that begins to, if they really practice diligently, even in the gyms and fitness centers, those who stick with it, they find themselves more lighter, freer, happier. They find themselves calmer. And some of them at least wake up to the fact that something is happening inside. Now the Orthodox religionists, they should be threatened, because this spiritual awakening of a higher consciousness, which has no immediate form when it first appears, can, at least from their orthodoxy point of view, therefore take an unorthodox form. They ought to be threatened. And yet, somebody told me recently, one of you, I think, that in a nearby Christian church, they retitled the yoga class into, movement in prayer or something like that, just to make it a little bit more palatable to people. It's not really a threat, but it is a threat if you think that the only way to receive divine grace is my way or the highway. You can darn be sure it is a threat. And yet it is a controversy. because, as that one yoga student who replied to my article said, it depends on the teacher. We're not going to resolve this controversy in any way, but those of us gathered in a place like this, and this is something of Ananda, which we understand that the true pranayama, the true control, the withdrawal of our energies to calm down the ego-active mind, to calm the turbulence of the mind and the emotions and the involvement in the tempests of our daily teapots or something, anyway, whatever that metaphor is. And to realize that we're free of all of that is true spirituality. This is the spirituality that isn't religious in the orthodox sense. But I'm here to say that it's religious in the highest sense. And those people who think they can practice yoga, even meditation, and have no affiliation, no communal worship, no sense of self-offering or yagya in their life, no willingness to sacrifice their ego on the altar of spirit, are fools. They might get slim, slender hips or whatever they get out of it, or maybe they'll reduce their stress a bit, but it is a religion in the highest and truest sense. And Ananda has stuck with that tradition, which is from ancient times, to represent that life force is divine. It is God. In Yogananda's autobiography, when he came out of an experience of cosmic consciousness, he asked his guru, Sri Yukteswar, he said, well, where's God? I mean, where is this dude? And Yukteswar just laughed him silly. He said, God is the joy of meditation. God is the peace of the soul. And when we can realize that behind closed eyes, if we meditate with right intention and right technique and understanding and so forth, that the peace that descends upon us like a weightless waterfall is the living presence of God, not channeled to us by some priest or through some sacrament or ritual or some credo, some belief system, but the living presence of divinity, which is your own self. That's a revolution. I don't know what else to call that. And that's what we represent. Not alone, obviously, but in terms of the yoga movement, the yoga industry, if you prefer. It needs to be held out. And that's what we are. Some people come here attracted to yoga and meditation and confused to practice Kriya Yoga, an advanced meditation technique of self-offering, of yagya, and to share that with other people. This is the inner kingdom, and that's inner kingdom of self-reliance and self-sufficiency, out of which we need no other grasping sort of things in the world that only harm the environment and only harm other people and have to take advantage of other people and I have to get mine first. We can't afford to have these newly developing nations follow our lead, for God's sakes. We'll all perish. We need a new reality of what is happiness and where it lies, as Jesus said, within ourselves. That's what we're doing here. And it's a great privilege to be involved with such a work and such a message. It isn't missionary, it isn't proselytizing. We have to live it. But that is both a challenge and an opportunity. And I know many of us here gathered and throughout the world representing such a high teaching feel very privileged to do so.
I'd like to read to you from Whispers from